Yeah, so my talk focuses on a little bit of work that we've been doing looking at the influence of treatment size and shape and the geography within these treatment operations overlay on patterns of rat recovery and using the doc rat tracking database to answer questions about the influence of these things. So ultimately our goal is to sustain viable populations of native forest birds, bats, lizards, insects, and the things we care about. And this depends on controlling rats and other key predators to near zero or below predator density impact thresholds when we know what these are. And after control, if we've been really effective, we're interested in slowing the recovery of rat and other predator populations as much as possible to create large time windows where native animals are not exposed to significant predation pressure or competition. We know, well, we're pretty confident now that immigration can and does play quite a big role in rat recovery after control. There are a number of studies in the literature that you can refer to. And so as we get better at controlling rats and these other predators to really low levels over large areas, immigration will necessarily become a much more important area of focus if we're to maximize the persistence of control. In particular, we want to understand what the optimal geometry of a treatment site might look like. Does it include mountains and rivers and lakes as barriers? And we also want to understand the immigration pathways that these predators use to reinvade sites after control. Because if we know what those where those pathways are, we potentially could impede immigration by applying control along those pathways. We have done a little bit of work on this in the past. We did a study some years ago in the Tararuas where we looked at patterns of rat recovery and tracking rates across a sort of a transect that traversed non-treated and treated areas. So the tracking tunnels that we focused on are sort of illustrated in this figure in the areas within the ellipsoids. So we have tracking tunnels on the outside at the end of the arrows in the light grey, and then tracking tunnels on the inside of the treated area and the darker grey area at the pointy end of the arrows. And we modelled tracking rates along that transect immediately after 1080 and for a couple of years afterwards. And we found the model that best explains that pattern of tracking rate change after 1080 was applied was a simple model that included time since distance as an interaction with straight line distance. But the study didn't sort of contemplate the impact that barriers might have played to, or wasn't able to measure the impact that barriers might have played directly, because we didn't have a method for doing that, or we didn't use a method for doing that. But this approach probably worked in our instance because both our transects ran up valley floors. There were no major obstacles of note between tracking tunnels on the outside and the inside, and so in this instance a sort of a straight line or a Euclidean distance worked pretty well. But like us, predators probably go around geographical boundaries that are hard or dangerous to cross. They probably take the easy route. And we know from the literature that rats are really recorded at high elevation. They don't like crossing snow or ice, according to a number of studies from South Georgia. And they're also impeded by large bodies of water. So we can infer from all of this that rats probably go around these features when they're encountered on the landscape. And in some instances, those features may be a complete barrier and stop immigration altogether. So how do we test the influence of geography on rat movements? Well, thankfully, there's a fairly well advanced approach with a large body of literature around it. It's called least cost pathways, that represents the geographical environment as a series of matrices that have a resistance value attributed to each cell within that matrix. And that cell sort of categorizes the difficulty with which, or the difficulty that is involved in crossing that particular cell. So a mountain might get a score of 10, whereas a valley floor might get a score of 1. And you can add these matrices together to form a cost surface, and then you can force animals to, or immigration pathways across those surfaces, and determine which are the least costly paths from one point to another. And that's exactly what we did. So initially we grabbed 178 series of tracking data from a series of 1080 operations across the country. We reduced that data set to only include those operations that had at least 3 years of post-control data. We removed data sets that had less than 5 post-control tracking tunnel surveys, and we removed all operations that had really poor kill rates. We only included those that had at least 95% kills. And that left us with 72 operations scattered across the country, and they're sort of illustrated in these red blobs on this map of New Zealand here. We also imported a series of geospatial surfaces, one with the operational polygons, one with an elevation surface for New Zealand, one for lakes, one for rivers, and another one that combined a sort of a buffered area of ocean around the coastline of New Zealand, and included areas or excised areas that were greater than 1,000 meters elevation. And then just to illustrate the process we use to extract data from each of those surfaces to our tracking tunnels, I'll just focus on the site that Josh just featured in his talk too. It's a site called Abbey Rotts on the west coast of the South Island of New Zealand. And so for each of these operational polygons in a large loop, we associated the tracking tunnel coordinates with all of the metrics that we created from those geospatial layers. So this map shows tracking tunnels in blue, these north-south facing little blue lines. And then there are a series of crosses that indicate places from which we don't think rodents could immigrate from. And then we've got a series of immigration points, these blue dots around the outside of each polygon, from which rats could immigrate back into the treated area. We excised all of those points from areas above 1,000 meters, from lakes, from areas that were excluded from treatment, but that were less than 300 meters across, and from the ocean. And then for each of these polygons, we created a Euclidean distance surface. So the red pixels at the center are the furthest away from the treatment boundary. They each have a value which relates to the distance between them and the treatment edge. We calculated from those a mean Euclidean distance for each treatment polygon, the Euclidean distance between each tracking tunnel and the edge, and we also calculated the total area covered by treatment in meters squared. And from the geospatial surfaces, we created a series of cost surfaces. On the top left, we have a null surface on which all the other surfaces were based. So you can see the tracking tunnels in the centre of the treatment area and around the edge, the potential points of immigration. And then in this case, in the null surface, we gave a 25-fold penalty for crossing the ocean. And then if we move across from left to right, we added to the null a 10-fold cost to high elevation areas in the bottom left of that frame, and an additional one-fold cost for every 100-metre elevation increment. So at 100 metres, a one-fold cost for every pixel crossed. At 900 metres, a 9-fold cost for every pixel crossed. And the bottom three cost surfaces are exactly the same as those immediately above, but have a 10-fold cost added for lakes and rivers. We then derived shortest paths from each potential immigration point to each tracking tunnel line. I've marked one with an X on the plot here as an exemplar, and then we reduced the shortest paths to only those within the 95th percentile. You can see in this case there's no penalty for crossing a lake, so the paths happily cross a lake. But when we add a penalty, a 10-fold penalty for crossing that lake, all the paths take the shortest route around the edge of the lake because there's a cost incurred from crossing it. So in this way we can sort of give the landscape sort of realistic costs for and test whether those costs are right. So we then ran a fairly simple modelling process in using the GLMMTMB package in R. We used the beta binomial error structure with C-log log link, and had random effects for operational area and line. We also added a crossed random effect for operation ID, which is the operation that may have occurred at we may have had many operations with an operational area, so that's to deal with that situation. And we had a tracked or not tracked response. So in the first instance, we ran a stage 1 series of models. We had a null model with tracks simply modelled as a function of time since treatment. And then we added to that a series of 30 simple models that included months since treatment, and then operational area or shape or straight line distance or least cost distance or least cost as either an additive or interactive addition to months since treatment. Just to note that we had 6 least cost distances based on each of those 6 surfaces, and 6 least cost cumulative costs, which is the cost of travelling along that line if you add up all of the costs of the pixels that line traverses. The preferred model of that suite was one that included an interaction between months since treatment and least cost surface number 5, which added a 10-fold penalty for areas of high elevation and for lakes, rivers, and the sea. Interestingly, treatment size and shape models were indistinguishable from the null model. We then ran a second stage modelling exercise where we added to that original base model a series of models that included either elevation and or season as both interactive and additive terms. and the preferred model of that suite was a model that included a three-way interaction between months since treatment, least cost, and elevation with season as an additive term. And just to show that in graphical terms, these are the model coefficients. Just ignore the three way or two-way interactions at the top here, and just focus on the coefficients for the individual terms. So as you'd expect, months since treatment predicted higher tracking rates. So with time since treatment, tracking rates increased. Those tracking tunnels that were hardest to get to had lower tracking rates, and those tracking tunnels that were at higher elevation had lower tracking rates also. And there was a slight increase in tracking rates in autumn. And just to visualize the interactive terms, what we see here is tracking rates up the Y, and then months since treatment scaled on X. It's 0 to 3 years. So 0 is effectively -1, and 3 years at 2. So the figure traverses that time period. The panels elevation -1 standard deviation from the mean. The middle panel is the mean elevation, and the far right hand panel is +1 standard deviation from the mean. And the colours 1 standard deviation minus from the mean, and then +1 standard deviation from the mean. So what we see is that shortly after 1080 application, rat tracking rate was highest at places that had the least cost to get to. So it was highest at easier to get to places. But with time, tracking rates increased most at places that were harder to get to, which is kind of interesting. And I think what might explain this is that initially you get animals reaching easy to get to places, they exhaust the food resource and then start declining, whereas places that are harder to get to, the food resource builds up in those places and then facilitates sort of a higher growth rates but before, I guess, there's an eventual asymptote reached. So what can we conclude from all of this? As we get better at large-scale rat control, immigration will become an increasingly important driver of rat population and needs necessarily to become a focus. Least cost methods are a useful way of understanding patterns of rat recovery after 1080, and they could be used to define immigration pathways. And the least cost approach could be used to sort of optimize the geometry of operational areas, and including identifying barriers that might be useful to impede immigration. And they could be used to enable targeted control along immigration pathways if we could define what they were. Thanks.
Thank you, James. That was fantastic. We've got time for one quick question before we have a little 5-minute break. So Doug Armstrong has asked, he said, very cool use of least cost pathway modelling. Is there any worry that the multiple least cost models lead to overfitting? And are you planning to use best model or multi-model inference using AIC weights?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. At this stage, it's very much a work in progress, Doug. And what I'd like to do is have those least cost services as continuous variables rather than categorical variables, which is kind of the way we're using them at the moment. So a lot of work to go yet.
Thanks, James.
And my brain's quite fuzzy after a couple of days in bed.
I was like, you've got 1 minute to answer that. So thank you very much to all our speakers from that session. We're just going to take a very quick 5-minute break now.